But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This episode is going to feel quite different. It's going to feel very different to pretty much everything else that's on this channel so far. It's not just putting up photos, it's not just a self-indulgent repeating of a journey that I went on to the south of France. It's also not intended to be like in the same way that the letters of Vincent van Gogh from 130 years ago. I don't want you to feel bound by time. I want you to more be transported to place. The whole idea, obviously when I went to Arles, it was really to go repeat the journey or imitate the journey Van Gogh did from Arles to Auvers-sur-Oise in the north, right? So in a weird way, that was my departure point in a way, Arles. I was leaving Arles to go somewhere else, and the destination was where I wanted to pay attention to. But obviously I spent some time in Arles. The way the trip was arranged was I spent 10 days in Portugal, 9 days in France, and 9 days in the Netherlands. And I'm going to be taking you through about the 3 or 4 days that I spent in Arles. But I'm going to start off by just sharing the journey to Arles and the arrival in Arles, what that was like, bearing in mind that the same thing happened to Van Gogh. He also traveled to Arles from Paris, but I mean originally Van Gogh was a Dutchman, so he traveled from the Netherlands into France and then all the way down to the bottom of France, and then he sort of came back the same way. Now in a strange way, I was kind of doing the same thing. I've got Dutch family. I have Dutch heritage. Weirdly enough, Vincent van Gogh's brother died probably about 30-40 kilometers from where I am right now, and so when I went to the Netherlands, it was actually the first time in my life that I'd been to the Netherlands, where my forebears come from. But to travel to Arles, I kind of went an indirect route. I arrived in Amsterdam, I spent an hour on the canals. I then went from there to Portugal. I spent 10 days just doing a true crime analysis of the Madeleine McCann case. That's something I'm going to be talking about on this channel and also on Patreon. That's also the subject matter of my book, Deep Into Darkness. But anyway, I went from Portugal into Arles, which is the south of France, right? So in the same way that Vincent van Gogh traveled by train from Paris to Arles, I traveled by train from where I was to Arles. Obviously not coming from the same place, but effectively the reason I did it also was I thought, why fly somewhere over Europe when you want to see Europe? So why go anywhere when you sort of on your way there and then deprive yourself of the experience of seeing it? So the whole idea was to go by train from where I was. Faro is right next to Praia de Luz, which is where Madeleine McCann disappeared. So I caught a train from Faro to Lisbon, going north, and then I went from Lisbon through Madrid, through Barcelona into the south of France. I think we went through Marseille, and then we're near Marseille, and then the train ultimately terminated at Nimes, and I then had to transfer, get out the train and transfer to catch a local train, the short little distance from Nimes to Arles, right? Now, for those of you who don't want to be confined to the sort of static flow of slides on this video, I'll put a link to my Instagram, and what you can do is if you left click, it'll take you from May 10th, which is when I was at the train station in Nimes, not in Nimes, Faro, and that just takes you through it's a photo journey, but on Instagram to into Arles, and you can go as far as you like. But I'm going to narrate basically what it was like getting on the train and all of that. Okay. If imitation was the name of the game, what I was trying to achieve, trying to sort of copy Van Gogh's journey, I kind of got more than I bargained for in a couple of ways. One of them was, obviously I was traveling by myself, and the trip to Europe wasn't really designed that way. I was actually supposed to meet a Canadian in Portugal. We were supposed to spend the 10 days together there, and then sort of at the last moment she pulled out, and I then decided to go anyway. And after the trip to Portugal, I kind of started feeling the loneliness a little bit of traveling by myself, in a way that was definitely weighing on me a little bit. I was definitely noticing it, and that made me think about Van Gogh, that he was also, everywhere he was going on his own. Everywhere he was staying on his own. And traveling is definitely a lot less fun when you're traveling constantly by yourself, like where all of it is on your own. There's definitely an aspect to it that is fun, where you're independent. If you decide to go this way, you can. If you want to go that way, you can. So there's that aspect, the independence aspect, and you can be as impulsive as you want to be. You can stay somewhere longer than you intended, or leave sooner than you intended, and there's no one else to kind of get permission. In that respect, it's nice traveling by oneself, but especially it's almost the more beautiful the area you're in, the more tragic it is if you're experiencing it on your own. So I guess one thing that I can take out of that is being able to share this with you is, I guess, some way of getting some relief from that loneliness at the time. But I definitely did feel it. What I thought I would also experience was, I thought by traveling by train I would see how beautiful Europe was. I would see all sorts of sights and sounds of Europe, and I think it's fair to say that traveling by train, certainly through Europe, you see the dirty underbelly of Europe. You are not really seeing Europe at its best when you travel by train. Certainly not going from Portugal to the south of France. So there were obviously stops at various train stations, and there were some sights and sounds that were worthwhile, but for the most part it was kind of dreary. And although public transport, I think, is something that makes Europe amazing, it's not particularly scenic, the train scenario. I think once the train started traveling through Spain, then you did see quite a few open landscapes, and it was quite scenic, it was quite attractive. I think by that time I was so tired that I didn't really care that much. It was a long trip. It was, I think, around about 36 hours. It was a long trip, and eventually I arrived in the little town of Nimes, which is a very historic town, very old town, very scenic little spot. And there I made one of a couple of changes that I'd made throughout the trip. I made another change in Madrid, and another change in Lisbon. But the journey had actually started in a place called Tunes. I guess Faro was where I parked my rental car. But then I caught a short train to a place called Tunes from Faro, and then from Faro to Lisbon, Madrid to Nimes, and then the last little section to Tunes. And so what happened on this last little section was I was standing on the platform waiting for my train, really needing to be home, needing for the trip to be over. It was a long time on trains at stations, and just feeling really tired. And there was a young woman sitting on my left, just calmly sitting there, and I was sort of a bit impatient for the train to arrive. A lot of the trains were on time. This particular train, I think, was 10 or 20 minutes late. And to make matters worse, I think I'd already missed the original train I was supposed to catch. And the reason I missed it was when I put my name into the computer. So I'd already booked the ticket, but when I put my name into it, because I've got 3 words in my surname, it just wouldn't recognize it. And every version I tried, it didn't pick it up. So it just kept putting out an error message. And because of that delay, I missed the train that I was scheduled to catch. It not the end of the world. I mean, I got a refund, but I just was a bit unnerved by it. So in the end, I was back up on the platform with a new ticket, waiting for my train, but a little bit flustered because I'd missed my original train, and just annoyed because of that. So I was kind of standing impatiently, looking at the board, wondering now, which train is it, kind of thing, and I guess a little bit anxious that I was going to miss another train. And I just didn't want to miss another train. I wanted to get where I needed to go. And the young woman that was sitting, there was an open chair next to her, but I was sort of standing more than sitting. And then I eventually sat down, and she turned to me and she said something, I can't quite remember what. I think she said, "Are you going to Arles?" And there was a funny moment where, I mean, she didn't pronounce it Arles. It was more like Arles or something like that. And every time I said it, I would totally butcher the name. But it turned out she was a police woman, or kind of a young police woman, just out of graduate school, whatever it is. And so that was what she did, and then she wanted to know what I did, and I said I write about true crime, and quickly got to talking about Van Gogh, and that I thought he'd been murdered, and she was quite interested in that. Then the train arrived, and I must say that the next probably hour passed by in almost like a dream. I mean, the next moment we were chatting and on the train, and then the next thing we arrived at Arles, and I kind of wanted to absorb the arrival in Arles and sort of take it step by step, and just experience it. Meanwhile, I was with her, and I was kind of getting this completely different experience, which is quite weird. Anyway, and then when we stepped through the station, she kind of walked off, and it was like, bye-bye, whatever. And I was like, am I going to catch a taxi? And when I looked at the taxis, they all looked really expensive. They were like limousines. Like all of them were Mercedes-Benzes and sort of very expensive cars. And she was sort of walking further and further away. And I eventually called her and I said, are you walking? Like, are you walking to where you're going? And she said, yes. I said, aren't you going to take a taxi? And she said, no. And I said, well, I wonder if I shouldn't walk. I mean, I don't want to take a taxi. But I don't know where to go. And so she suggested she would guide me to where I needed to go. I showed her where I needed to go. And then I was carrying quite a few bags, whereas she was traveling very, very light. And in the end, she actually picked up the handle of one of my bags. I had the other handle, and then we sort of walked through Arles. And I mean, it was really quite amazing. It was quite amazing. Just the second you merge out of the station, you're in this very, very old little town. Obviously with a lot of history of Van Gogh, but also besides Van Gogh, just a lot of history. Now, I'm from a country that the entire country is, it's not very old. It's 1 or 2 or 300 years old, whereas this town was like over 1,000 years old. And just the history of Van Gogh is well over 100 years old, 130 years old. So it was quite amazing, and she led me on a special route, a sort of shortcut, right to the center of Arles. And there she actually said to me she'd worked there as a kind of a tourist guide, I think while she was studying to be a cop or something. And then that was where our trip ended. And I must say, I can say my entire trip through Europe, lasting about 28 days, that little moment getting off the train and going into Arles with her was probably the highlight. It was really a magical experience. And then I took a couple of photos, and then she was standing by my bags, and I just didn't ask her permission. I just quickly took a photo. And then I was kind of on my own, and as soon as she was out of the picture, it was quite stressful, because it was not easy to understand the labyrinth of that little town. It's not a conventional street grid or town grid. It's not sort of parallel vertical lines and parallel horizontal lines. It's lots of little squiggly lines. And even though I had a map, I couldn't kind of reconcile the map with what I was seeing. I knew there was a canal, but there was more than one canal. I knew there was a bridge, but there was more than one bridge. And I kind of just couldn't figure out what was going on. And it was okay to do that if you weren't carrying heavy bags and you weren't tired, but every 100 meters you walked was quite a labor. And I really didn't want to walk somewhere and then come back or whatever. And so I found a sign, and the sign said Pont van Gogh, and I thought that was a good sign, seeing the sign. It was, but I was still quite a long way from where I needed to go. And then I sort of walked down this road along a canal, and by the time I sort of approached the end of it, I thought I was well and truly lost, because there were sort of no houses left. And I just was kind of about to give up, to be honest. I was just like, I don't know what is going on here. And as I sort of made a U-turn, just wheeling, not sure what to do, someone sort of stepped out of a wall. What I mean is, it was like literally a door in a wall. Someone sort of stepped out of it, and they were, well, it turned out to be the people that I was staying with. And then it was quite weird. The woman said to me, we actually tried to pick you up at the station, but you weren't there. And I said, well, yes, I know my train was late. And she said, well, we tried to call you. And I said, yes, well, my phone battery had died. All sorts of sob stories. But it kind of gave me a weird sense of conflicted feelings. Was that if they had been there, if I had caught my train on time, I wouldn't have had that experience with the young French girl that I did. I mean, just walking into this town, chatting away, and just having history sort of wash over you. I don't know. It was quite a cool experience. Anyway, inside this little inside this wall was a tiny little room. I'd originally booked quite a nice room in a hotel for possibly me and another person, as the Canadian that I was going to travel with. And then when that, I didn't know whether the trip to Portugal might extend to 1 or 2 days in France as well. But anyway, so then I cancelled that and I made arrangements for something for me, and it was obviously very modest. Some of the Airbnb spots that I wanted were sold out when I went back to them, so this was kind of what I ended up with. It was quite cheap, but yeah, I think what I wrote in my notebook is I wrote that it kind of had a funny smell. I said on the 11th of May that this was like sleeping in a barrel with 3 scuba divers breathing loudly out of their tanks. After glugging whiskey and half a sleeping pill, which took no effect, I then tried to sleep. I also made a note in this notebook that the train traveled at 222 kilometers per hour at one point, and as I say, it was like experiencing the dirty underbelly of Europe. I met a Spanish guy on one particular train where I kind of lost my seat because there were 2 trains connected to each other and I'd gotten onto the wrong one, and you couldn't get through to the other one because they were sort of nose to nose. Anyway, and the guy that I met was a oil worker in Gibraltar, I think, and I think I met an engineer as well, and that was definitely quite interesting. I think after I put my bags down, I headed out quite quickly again with my camera. Even though I was pretty tired, I was just quite intrigued by the glimpse that I'd had of this beautiful little town. I was really surprised by how beautiful it was. And so I sort of I tried to retrace my steps. Obviously it was a lot easier just carrying a camera and inspiration, and I sort of headed out there. By this time it was quite late. The sun, it was sort of late-ish afternoon, and I sort of walked down the alleys of Arles, and they were it was quite an amazing thing. They were very windy. There's a lot of wind blowing down these alleys, and it made kind of a whistling noise and kind of a whispery noise, kind of the sound that air makes when it passes quickly alongside walls and street poles and all that kind of thing. And it just gave it a very atmospheric vibe, which I didn't expect. I mean, you think of history in that way, but for it to actually be that way, because that is how nature has manifested ultimately, not just nature but also man's structures, was kind of surprising and definitely quite charming. So that was the arrival in Arles. I'm not going to take it further than that. Oh, by the way, that reference to the scuba divers, I think that was actually a reference to sleeping in this train overnight. It was this tiny, narrow small little compartment with 6 people in it, and you couldn't really move. And even though I'd taken a sleeping pill and had some whiskey, I just couldn't sleep. And everyone around you sleeping and snoring. But anyway, that was my arrival in Arles, and I think that is why I was so exhausted, was because of a terrible night's sleep. And then I'm going to take you in the next episode through what I saw in Arles, some of it being Van Gogh's spots that he painted, where he lived, and And then in the third episode, I'm going to take you with me on my trip to Saint-Remy on a mountain bike. So that'll be the third episode. As I mentioned earlier, I'll put a link for you in the description where you can go through the, obviously it's in chronological order, you can go through the images on Instagram, click to the left to go forwards in time, and back if you want to go backwards in time. You can also look at my trip through Praia de Luge, which I'm going to be touching on separately in some content about Madeleine McCann, just as we get a little bit closer to May. Yeah, so you can go further, and then there's also some video which gives you the sights and sounds of Arles if you're interested. So I guess I'll see you guys next time for part 2 in this series.